In a quiet corner of Elmville, Wisconsin, the late afternoon sun hung like a copper coin above the rolling fields, casting long shadows that painted the rural road in bronze and gold. The air buzzed with the low hum of cicadas, a constant reminder that summer had not yet loosened its grip. Down County Road 12, where the trees grew close enough to form a shaded tunnel, a 1974 Dodge tradesman van clattered along, coughing with each bump in the road. It was rust-covered, its sky-blue paint faded and chipped, with patches of primer showing through like old scars. The back windows were smudged, and one of the rear doors was tied shut with thick rope. It was a van long past its prime, yet it rolled forward with purpose. Behind the wheel sat Randy Miller, age 79, hunched slightly but steady, his fingers firm on the cracked steering wheel. He wore a red and black flannel shirt with sleeves rolled up to the elbow, revealing wiry, tanned arms mapped with age spots and scars. His denim jeans were threadbare at the knees, and his boots were scuffed with cement dust. The cabin of the van smelled faintly of sawdust, old coffee, and motor oil. On the passenger seat sat a thermos, dented and scratched, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A handwritten list, creased, smudged, and neatly folded, was tucked beneath a pair of reading glasses on the dashboard. The list was full of names and addresses, each line followed by a task in tidy, block-letter handwriting: fixed porch rail, Mrs. Jenkins, widowed, wheelchair ramp, Tim H., Vietnam vet, check heating unit, 309, 5th Street, elderly, no heat. He was returning from Hendrick's Supply Depot, where he had used his own savings to buy cement mix and planks to reinforce the back floor of the Pine Haven Animal Shelter. The shelter had flooded the previous week during a freak thunderstorm, leaving several kennels unstable and unsafe. When the shelter director called the county for help, they were told there were no funds until the next quarter. Randy, who had overheard the complaint while picking up lumber for another project, simply said he'd take care of it. No questions, no invoice. This was Randy's rhythm. He moved quietly through Elmville and the surrounding towns, always alone, always working. He took no payments, left no business cards. Some folks tried to tip him with pies, others left tools on his porch. He accepted only what he needed, never more. Most people in Elmville knew him by sight, a familiar figure at hardware stores, grocery lines, or the post office. He wasn't a man of many words, but he remembered names, remembered service records, remembered if someone's roof leaked or their garden gate wouldn't close. As he rounded a bend near the old dairy barn, the rhythmic clatter of his engine was interrupted by a different sound, one too familiar to ignore. Behind him, red and blue lights bloomed across the rearview mirror, followed by a single short chirp of the siren. A sheriff's cruiser, white and new, was speeding up behind him, kicking up dust like a trailing storm. Randy slowed and pulled to the gravel shoulder, the van jerking slightly as he parked. He turned off the engine and kept his hands on the wheel. Two young deputies emerged from the cruiser. Both were clean-shaven, with mirrored sunglasses and buzz cuts, their uniforms crisp in the sunlight. They approached the van cautiously, as though it might spring to life and bolt. One tapped the driver's side window with the back of his knuckle. Randy rolled it down with a slow, practiced crank, the window groaning as it descended. The deputy leaned in slightly, brow furrowed. "License and registration, please." Randy nodded and reached slowly toward the glove compartment. His hands moved deliberately, each action measured. He offered up a worn leather wallet and a folded registration slip. The younger deputy took them, glancing down before stepping away. The second officer, standing further back, eyed the vehicle with suspicion. "Sir, what's your destination today?" "Back to the shelter," Randy replied. His voice was gravelly, slow, but not feeble. "Fixing the floor." "The shelter?" "Pine Haven. They had a flood." The deputy squinted, unimpressed. "This vehicle registered to you?" "It is." A long pause followed. The younger deputy returned, still holding the registration. "This van looks like it belongs in a scrapyard," he muttered. "We get a lot of calls about abandoned vehicles out here. Figured it was one of them." Randy gave a small shrug. "It runs." The two deputies exchanged glances. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, sir," one of them said. There was no raised voice, no aggression, but the words had weight. Randy complied. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed open the door. The movement wasn't easy. His knees creaked, his back bent, and his left hip ached with the memory of a break decades old. When he stood, it was with a slow grace, dignified despite the stiffness. He stepped onto the shoulder and waited. "Please sit down," the deputy instructed, gesturing toward the ground. Randy looked down at the gravel-strewn asphalt. It was still hot from the afternoon sun. He lowered himself carefully, crossing his legs with difficulty. His hands rested on his knees, withered fingers still streaked with concrete dust. He said nothing. The deputies moved to the back of the van. They pulled open the side door and peered inside. A cracked toolbox sat on a wooden crate. Bags of Quikrete, stacked too high, filled the back corner. An old broom, an orange safety vest, and a hand drill were strapped into place with bungee cords. One deputy found the folded list on the dashboard and began reading it aloud. "What is this?" he scoffed. "Santa's workshop for senior citizens?" The other chuckled. "Maybe he's casing houses. Look at this, addresses, notes, all kinds of scribbles." The younger one snapped a picture with his phone, shaking his head. "This'll go viral for sure," he muttered. They didn't notice the thermos still sitting on the seat. Or the way the handwriting on the list never wavered, each letter printed with care, without shakiness. They didn't see the decades of service tucked into the corners of Randy's quiet existence. They didn't know that every person on that list had a story, and that Randy knew each one of them by heart. For the deputies, it was routine. Just another eccentric old man in a junker van. But for Randy, this was something else. He sat on the asphalt in the fading sun, dust collecting on his boots. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. There was no bitterness in his eyes. Just stillness. A stillness that would soon stir something far beyond that rural roadside. "Let me know how you'd like this adjusted before I move forward to part 2. The sun was slipping lower now, stretching the shadows across the gravel like long fingers reaching for the horizon. Randy remained seated on the hot shoulder of the road, his hands resting lightly on his thighs, eyes downcast but not ashamed. A small breeze picked up dust and carried it gently across the road, catching in the creases of his flannel shirt. His thermos, still full of lukewarm coffee, sat unnoticed on the front seat of the van. It reflected the sunlight in a dull glint, like a lighthouse signaling from a forgotten coast. The deputies continued their inspection. They opened every door, poked around with their flashlights, even tapped on the floorboards. One of them knelt to examine the cement bags, poking a finger into a small tear in one of the paper sacks. He pulled it away covered in gray powder and brushed it off with a grimace. "Toolbox, cement, random addresses," the younger deputy said, squinting at the list again. "This guy's either a hoarder or halfway into something shady." The other deputy leaned over the back seat and found an old Polaroid tucked inside a zippered pouch. It showed a group of young men standing in front of a barracks, their uniforms crisp and their faces too serious for their age. One man, clearly the tallest, stood at the far left, Randy, decades younger, his eyes still unmistakable. He tossed the photo onto the seat like it didn't matter. "Looks like he's got some kind of army obsession, too." They didn't ask what unit it was. They didn't notice the faded tattoo beneath Randy's sleeve, the remnants of a once bold insignia, now sun-worn and broken by time. They didn't ask about the names on the list, the dates beside each task, or why he had notes like "call before 8, oxygen tank," and "don't knock, granddaughter's night shifts." The asphalt pressed heat into Randy's bones. His knees ached, and the curve of his spine pulled painfully with every breath. Still, he remained silent. He could hear the mocking tone in the officers' voices, could see the disdain and the sideways glances, but he offered nothing in return. They were young. He was old. That was the line they drew. A few cars passed on the road, neighbors, delivery trucks, a teenager with music thumping from a cracked window. No one stopped. The van's rusted shell and Randy's age made it too easy to ignore. But someone did see. A silver Subaru slowed as it passed the scene. Inside, a woman named Casey pressed her foot gently to the brake. She worked with the Pine Haven shelter and had spent the last week trying to find a contractor willing to help for less than the shelter's meager budget. When Randy walked in that morning and quietly told her he'd handle it, she'd been so relieved she nearly cried. Now, she saw him sitting on the ground with his head bowed, the battered van surrounded by uniforms and judgment. She turned into a nearby driveway and reversed down the shoulder until she reached them. Rolling down her window, she leaned out. "Hey, what's going on?" she called out. "That's Randy Miller. He's fixing our shelter floor today. Is something wrong?" One of the deputies looked over his shoulder but didn't answer. The other gave a shrug. "We're checking out a suspicious vehicle," he said, as if the explanation should suffice. Casey frowned. "Suspicious? That's Randy. He's done repair work for half the town." "Ma'am, we're handling it," the deputy replied firmly, making a vague motion with his hand as though waving her off. "I don't think you understand who that is," Casey said, voice rising slightly. "He's a veteran. He's helped just about every nonprofit in this county. There's probably not a single person at Pine Haven who hasn't seen him fixing something." The deputy's expression tightened. "We appreciate the concern, ma'am, but this is standard procedure." Randy, still seated, didn't speak. He looked toward Casey and gave her a slow nod, one that said thank you, but also please don't make it worse. Casey hesitated. She wanted to press harder, but the standoff felt like stone. She pulled away reluctantly, glancing back in the mirror as the deputies returned to the van. At the same time, a different kind of witness watched from across the street. At the Quick Mart on the corner, Thomas Reyes stood behind the counter, half watching the monitors and half reading a paperback novel. A former combat medic and veteran of Iraq, he knew the shape of injustice when he saw it. He recognized Randy the moment he saw the van. Everyone did, eventually. Reyes had once seen Randy rebuild a collapsed front porch for a wheelchair-bound widow without accepting so much as a sandwich in return. He saw the way Randy sat. Not defiant. Not afraid. Just waiting. It was the posture of someone who had been through harder things and knew the value of patience. Reyes picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He paused on one name. General Joseph Markham. He dialed. When the voice on the other end answered, Reyes didn't bother with pleasantries. "There's something going on out on County Road 12. It's Randy." "Yeah, that Randy." A pause. "He's being detained." "Over what?" "A van and a toolbox, apparently." Another pause. Then the line went silent. Outside, Randy still sat on the hot gravel, the sun slipping lower, the air cooling in the shade. The deputies were now standing near their cruiser, bored and unsure what to do next. The photo had been posted, the paperwork inspected, the judgment passed. But something unseen had already started moving. Miles away, a black SUV rolled out of a government lot. Inside, a man in full military dress checked his watch and leaned forward. "Drive," he said. "We're going to Elmville." The shadows had grown long across the road by the time the black SUV crossed the county line. Its polished surface caught the last traces of sunlight, a gleaming anomaly among the dusty trucks and aging sedans that lined the rural streets. Its tires moved with purpose, crunching softly over gravel and potholes like it belonged to another world entirely, a world of ceremony, order, and rank. Back on County Road 12, Randy remained still. The pain in his knees had faded into a dull ache, the kind he'd learned to live with over the years. The deputies had returned to their cruiser and were now leaning against it, scrolling through their phones, laughing quietly at something unseen. They'd moved on in their minds. To them, this was a harmless story to tell later, an old man, a clunker van, a list full of chicken scratch. They didn't notice the small crowd that had Beg N together. It began with Casey, who had driven just far enough down the road to park safely and return on foot. She stood now near the edge of the gravel, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Randy. Her presence alone pulled in others. First a man in a delivery uniform who had just finished his route. Then a mother with 2 children strapped into the back of her minivan. A pair of high school students slowed their bikes and stopped nearby. Their phones were already recording. One of them recognized Randy immediately. "He fixed our neighbor's ramp last year," the boy whispered. Within minutes, murmurs turned into questions. Why was he being detained? What had he done? Was he okay? Casey answered as best she could, her voice steady but rising in urgency. "He's a veteran," she repeated to anyone who asked. "He helps everyone. That van isn't junk, it's his workshop. He's done more for this community than anyone I know." Some nodded, others pulled out their phones. Photos were taken, videos recorded. And still, Randy sat, calm, enduring, never demanding. Across the road, Thomas Reyes locked up the Quick Mart, his apron tucked under one arm. He crossed over slowly, nodding once to Randy, who returned it with a faint smile. "Help is coming," Reyes said softly. Randy didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that silence, when chosen, could carry more weight than protest. The quiet was broken by the sudden arrival of the black SUV. It didn't just pull up, it arrived. Tires crunched, engine idled low. The rear door opened before the vehicle had fully stopped. Out stepped a man whose very posture shifted the weight of the scene. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a formal U.S. Army uniform. Medals lined his chest in tight, straight rows. Silver stars gleamed beneath the golden light. A cap tucked beneath one arm bore the insignia of a 4-star general. General Joseph Markham. The crowd instinctively quieted. Even the deputies straightened. One adjusted his belt. The other stood with hands behind his back, as if he too sensed the sudden shift in atmosphere. The general walked past the cruiser without looking at either officer. His boots moved deliberately across the gravel, crunching louder than the murmurs in the air. He stopped in front of Randy and extended a hand, not to shake, but to offer help up. Randy looked up at the general. Recognition passed silently between them. "On your feet, Sergeant Miller," the general said, voice low but clear. Randy accepted the hand and stood. Slowly, with the stiffness of age and honor hard-earned, he rose from the asphalt. The general helped him brush the dust from his pants and then turned to face the crowd and the deputies. "This man," he said, lifting his voice for all to hear, "is Sergeant First Class Randall Miller, retired. He served this nation for nearly 30 years. He trained elite rescue units, led field operations that saved countless lives, and since retirement has dedicated every day to serving the people of this community without asking for a single thing in return." The 2 deputies stood frozen. The younger one lowered his gaze. The other cleared his throat but said nothing. "This van," the general continued, gesturing toward the vehicle, "is a registered historical vehicle, recognized by both the state and federal departments. The registration is renewed annually and on record. His work is known to the VA, to local government, and to nearly every military support organization in the state." No one spoke. The general turned to the deputy holding the registration and photograph. "I assume you've seen his service record by now." The deputy nodded, slowly. "I suggest," the general said, quieter now, "that next time you meet a man you don't understand, you start with questions before you offer judgment." There was no anger in his voice. Just disappointment. And that, somehow, landed heavier. The general turned to Randy again. "If it's all right, sir, I'd like to ride with you the rest of the way to the shelter." Randy nodded. The 2 men walked slowly to the van. Randy opened the passenger door, cleared off the seat, and handed the general the thermos. As they climbed in, the general paused and looked back at the deputies. "Gentlemen," he said, "you might want to start reading your town's history. Sometimes, heroes don't wear their medals on their chest. They carry them in their silence." With that, the van rumbled back to life and pulled away, the general seated beside the man who had once saved his life during a failed training exercise 2 decades earlier. Back at the roadside, no one moved. Casey wiped her eyes. Reyes crossed his arms. The young deputy looked down at his boots and said nothing. From a single stop on a quiet road, a different kind of story had big *N to travel, one that couldn't be laughed away or dismissed with a post. And it had only just big *N. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time itself were catching its breath. The video of the general stepping from the black SUV spread across phones and screens like a quiet storm. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it didn't need to be. It spoke through stillness, through the simple act of a man in uniform lifting another man from the hot pavement. It spoke through the silence that followed, the silence of a town remembering what it had forgotten. Within 48 hours, the photo of Randy sitting beside his van had been seen by millions. But the story changed. It was no longer a moment of ridicule, it was a lesson in reverence. People read about Randy's quiet work, the ramps built, the roofs patched, the stoves installed before winter set in. Local reporters came first, then national media. They didn't find a man eager for attention. They found someone with hands still calloused from the day's work and a voice that rarely strayed from the point. When asked why he never sought recognition, Randy simply said, "Because things need fixing." The town of Elmville stirred like a field after a long frost. The mayor, previously known more for photo ops than action, signed a proclamation establishing June 3rd as Randy Miller Day. The date wasn't random, it was the day Randy had been pulled over, the day Elmville was forced to look at itself. A nonprofit formed almost overnight. The Miller Initiative, run by a board of veterans and local volunteers, raised over $300,000 in 10 days. The mission was clear: to continue Randy's work, to serve those quietly surviving veterans, the elderly, the forgotten. Local businesses donated supplies. Young people who had never held a hammer showed up asking to learn. And yet, Randy changed little. He still drove the same van, the engine as rough as ever. He still packed a sandwich and thermos each morning and checked his list before turning the key. On the 23rd ramp of that summer, he adjusted the level with the same care he gave to every project before. It wasn't about the recognition. It never had been. But others changed. The younger of the 2 deputies, his name was Nathan, began showing up at the Veterans Center after his shifts. At first, people avoided him. Whispers followed him down the hall. But he didn't leave. He scrubbed wheelchairs, served coffee, swept floors. One morning, Randy handed him a wrench without a word, and they spent 3 hours under the same porch, repairing a beam for a man who had served in Korea. Redemption, it turned out, came not in grand gestures but in repeated acts of humility. At the sheriff's department, new recruits were now required to read Randy's story before they received their badges. It was printed, laminated, and stored in every training binder. The sheriff called it a study in quiet dignity. A few months later, the general returned, not in uniform, but in jeans and a buttoned shirt. He drove himself this time. There was no formality, no announcement. He pulled up to Randy's porch with 2 folding chairs and a cooler of iced tea. They sat there long into the evening, talking about nothing and everything, watching the fireflies rise like tiny lanterns into the dusk. They didn't speak of the SUV or the deputies. They didn't speak of medals or past missions. They spoke of wood types, weatherproofing, the best screws for steep ramps. They spoke as 2 men who had both lived through the unspoken and who found peace in work that left no audience. In town, a bronze plaque was installed on the very corner where Randy had once been told to sit down on the pavement. The inscription was simple. Not every hero speaks. Some build. The plaque bore his name, but the story belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked, misjudged, or dismissed because of age, poverty, or silence. New cadets now carried laminated cards, distributed on the first day of service training. On the back, above the county seal, were just 7 words. You never know who you're stopping. Randy never asked for it. He never read the online comments, never watched the news segments. But he did notice something one morning as he backed out of his driveway. A police cruiser passed him going the other way. It slowed. And then, without a word, it pulled gently to the shoulder. The officer inside gave a solemn nod, hand briefly raised in silent respect. Randy nodded back, a slight smile touching his lips. He turned the wheel and rolled forward, the old van rattling like a memory that refused to fade. Because in the end, the lesson wasn't loud. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about seeing. And remembering. That behind every withered hand, every dented van, every quiet voice, there might be someone who spent a lifetime giving everything they had. Kindness without question is enough.